Dzień dobry. That's it. The rest, I'm afraid, is in English. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here to speak to you today. It's really an honour to be asked, not just to talk about a subject I feel passionate about, but also to be asked to a country where some of the most exciting developments in my particular form of therapy has been happening recently, as well as a country that is, of course, beautiful, and one I've come to have huge respect for over the years. I was asked to speak first, which has its benefits and has its costs and threats. I suppose the main benefit is I got to choose which bits I talked about, and some of my colleagues who follow me might find that some of their bits have been stolen. So I apologise in advance to the other people speaking about ACT today. I'm not going to attempt to reproduce the detail of any one of the different, innovative, exciting therapies we're going to hear about in the next 2 days. Instead, I want to look more broadly at some of the ideas, the philosophy, the basics that underpin several of the therapies we'll hear about today. Not all of them, but several of them. It gives me the opportunity to show you more nice pictures rather than complicated graphs, and that always suits me. So as I think you've heard, my name is Ray Owen, and I'm a clinical psychologist. Lydia could actually have said absolutely anything about me, and I would have no idea. I assume you said basically that. Thank you. I work as a clinical psychologist in a part of the UK called Herefordshire. There we go, that's Herefordshire, that's where I live and work. And it must be said, it's a beautiful part of the world. Beautiful countryside, beautiful towns. And it has exactly its fair share of depression and anxiety and anger and violence and prejudice as any other part of my country or anybody else's country. What it also has is its share of illness, physical illness, including, including serious illnesses like cancer, which is the area I've chosen to work in for the last 25 years, where I work in the community. I work in hospitals, including the one you see at the top, and a wonderful hospice that I also work in at the bottom. My reason for telling you this is not that I'm here to talk about cancer care, end-of-life care, or even physical health care, though I talked to some of you about this yesterday. My reason for pointing this out is that the kind of people I've worked with and the problems they were facing kind of changed my view of psychological support. And that's what got me involved with some of the approaches we're going to hear about, particularly today. The ones I'm going to focus on are particularly those we could label, and this is where we get into some of the slides, of course being in English, and full of technical terms, for which I apologise. Contextual behavioural science. We might say more easily psychological flexibility. Doesn't mean exactly the same, but it's close. And this isn't actually one approach to psychological therapy. This is kind of almost a family of closely linked approaches. It's different to some of the other things we're going to hear about in the next 2 days, But I think we're going to see some common themes coming through. It's those common themes I'd like us to focus on. We'll hear later about some aspects of some of these other ways of working around relational frame theory, and I think there's some functional analytic psychotherapy as well. You'll hear all about that. There's something important I want to say, that nothing I say about any one of these models do I want you to take as I believe that's the one truth, that that's the one way. What I'm talking about, I think, is a way of working with people, of dealing with human suffering, that I've found very useful. Some of it is present in the other approaches for the next 2 days, some of it's distinct. But rather than getting completely lost in all the technical terms, I'd always much rather think in terms of people. So I want to introduce you to a patient of mine I met many years ago. I've changed her name, etc. And she really stuck with me. I've probably seen 6 or 10 people presenting almost identically over the following years. But there's something about this person that presented a real challenge to me as a clinical psychologist. And it was only as I became more involved in these newer techniques that I found an easier way to navigate through what we could do to help Donna. So this is Donna. Donna is a 38-year-old woman. She had a young daughter, Amy, and a supportive husband, Pete. Now, there are all sorts of traditional ways of describing a person when we do a case presentation. Here's where I like to start. Here's what mattered to Donna. This is what was most important in her life. She was very committed to spending time with her family. She liked to be a loving, supportive mother. She loved doing interesting things with them. She liked to get things done at work. She achieved things. And she was also a big part of her local community. Those were the things that kind of defined Donna at her best, what she wanted her life to be about. And sadly, the reason she got to meet me was she was then diagnosed with cancer of the breast, which was quite advanced at the time it was diagnosed. And already her liver and her bones had become involved with secondary cancers. Actually, initially, she was very strong, we might say. She was very determined to beat this problem. She was very clear about moving forward. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that couldn't last. By the time I met Donna, she was sad, tearful, distressed a lot of the time. But more than that, she was staying in bed. Much more so than her physical health needed. She was well enough to be up and about, but she was in bed a lot of the time. And most importantly, she was avoiding Amy. She wasn't spending time with her child. In fact, she was actively avoiding. If Amy came to her with homework, wanting to play, Donna would withdraw. Mummy feels poorly, I've got to go to bed. Daddy will look after you. And yet she was lying awake in bed, worrying. And if anybody tried to cheer her up, or be positive, or say things might not be so bad, unsurprisingly, she became very angry and pushed them away. In talking to Donna, it was clear that yes, she felt miserable and desperate, and hopeless, and terrified for her future. She was full of thoughts like, I'll become a burden. While I am ill, I will make everybody else's life worse around me. This is going to be so hard for my daughter, which her mother is ill and dying, and she's going to have to grow up without a mother. Her mother's not going to be there for her first day at the big school, the first time a boyfriend or a girlfriend breaks up with her, her first period, walk her down the aisle at her wedding. These were the things that Donna's mind was full of. So here's my question. Out of all those thoughts and the feelings that came with them, which of them was irrational? Which of them was wrong and inaccurate? Which of them could we change to make her feel better? Because I'm not sure we could with any of them. Because actually, they're all true. They're all true. And in that situation and with those thoughts, I think the rest of us would feel maybe something like Donna does anyway. The things that bring her deepest sadness, or it could have been fear, anger, or regret, can't be argued away. They can't be suppressed and pushed down. They can't be ignored successfully, not for long. Little periods maybe, but not for long. Now, look, I'm really sorry to start the day off with such a bleak and depressing story. Welcome to my working world. But the point for telling Donna's story is that's not just Donna's story. And it's not just the story of people who are physically ill. That's the human story as well. The key element is in everyone's story. We all carry those thoughts and those feelings and those losses with us all the time. And it's kind of easy to look at Donna and her context, her situation, and say, yes, we can see why. Yet one of the things about us humans is we're capable of all of that when there isn't an easy to pin down thing that's causing it from the outside. One of the founders of this acceptance and commitment therapy approach once said this: the single most remarkable fact about human existence is how hard it is for humans to be happy. And off we go. We humans can suffer in the midst of plenty. Give us the things that we believe humans need to make us happy. Give us shelter, warmth, food, people who love us around us, things to do. And some of us, and maybe at times all of us, will feel sad, angry, fearful, shamed. Even with material success, people will suffer. And some will suffer enough even to decide to end that suffering by killing themselves. But we even write pop songs about it. For anybody who's not brought up on the Beatles, here's a song about a successful man who killed himself in his car because he hadn't noticed that the lights had changed from red. So why is this tendency to suffering, even in the midst of the basic things we need in life, why is it so common? I'm sure there are lots of ways of explaining this. Here's one way. One way of explaining it is this: that particularly in recent Western culture, that we've been sold a lie. And that lie is the lie of healthy, happy normality. That the default state, the natural state for a human being is to be healthy and to be happy. And if we're not happy, particularly, then something is wrong. Something must have gone wrong for us not to be happy. And we need to put it right. We have a need to pursue happiness, to restore our natural entitlement to happiness. Look, some countries even put it in their constitution. It's right up there, the American Constitution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's a problem with that. I don't know about you, but for me, happiness isn't a constant thing. It's not all there all the time. And if I chase happiness, something odd begins to happen. I used to think that. Then, you'll be pleased to hear that I actually found the answer to how to have happiness. Okay, you ready for this? This might be a revelation to you. I want you to concentrate. I found this on a street in Cambridge, in England. It was the final answer to how to be happy. The words came to me: Beer and food equal happiness. Now look, I'm not some armchair philosopher. Originally, a long time ago, I was a proper scientist. I put things to the test. So here's me putting things to the test in that very cup. As you can see, the experiment proved a success. The food was excellent. The beer was very good. By the way, those are very small beer glasses. I do not have huge hands. And look at me, I'm happy. And I stayed happy for a good 10, 20 minutes. And then I went outside in the cold, and I went to the bookshop that I thought I was going to be able to get a particular book in, and they didn't have it. I got colder, and I got less happy, and my happiness dropped further. Okay, now you know the answer to happiness. What did I need to do next? More beer, more food. And I'm sure that would have worked. But can we notice a problem with that? The problem with that is the things that might restore us or move us towards our happiness may well be temporary, and if we continue to pursue them, they may bring problems. Look, you can see, they bring problems. So here's the thing. In reality, healthy, happy normality doesn't really seem to be that normal at all. Because human suffering's everywhere. If we're interested in sort of psychological disorders, diagnoses, if that's a way that we find useful to look at things, then the incidence of them is really high and growing. Even people who don't end up having access to mental health systems, don't have a description of a particular psychological problem, they still need help, they're still struggling. There's divorce, sexual concerns, there's abuse, violence, prejudice, and some really destructive behaviours, some really destructive responses to suffering are really common, including self-harm, cutting myself, and including suicide. So the thought becomes, if it's that common, well, maybe suffering is part of normal human functioning. Maybe happiness isn't really what this is about, or indeed the absence of sadness, or anger, or fear. Now we've got to be careful there, what we mean by the word happiness, and I'm really aware I'm being translated from English to Polish, so there will be nuances of translation here. But some of this isn't about English and Polish, some of this goes back way further. Some of this is about perhaps differences between Western philosophies and Eastern philosophies. And some of this is about distinctions even within classical Western philosophy, Greek philosophy. So, I'm sure some of you in this room know this. What gets translated certainly into English as happiness, there's two distinct strands of how that has been made sense of, even in Western philosophy. Okay, perhaps the more traditionally held view is what from the Greek will be euphoria, good feeling, feeling good pleasure. You know, that stuff that makes you smile, makes you feel great and up. That sense of happiness. And maybe that's what I was chasing with the beer and the burgers. An alternative way that happiness has been talked about is this, what's called eudaimonia, or eudaimonic tradition of talking. Now, again, I don't know about Polish, but in English, there isn't a very clear translation of that. The closest we get in English is something like human flourishing, or vitality. And this has been seen as a key to a good life by lots of people over the years. So some of the Greek philosophers, particularly the Stoics, drawing from Socrates, some psychologists like Maslow, and I don't know if anybody here is involved in the positive psychology approach, our movement. This has been at the heart of their thinking. So you know that's not desperately new. So that sounds like quite a good deal to me. To have a life that's more about flourishing, that's more about a meaningful, rich existence. Maybe that holds a benefit to us beyond merely chasing happiness or trying to eliminate sadness, feels, those negative things. Well, that's great. But our next question is, nice, how do I get some of that? And that's what some of these approaches that we're talking about today, and I'm sure tomorrow as well, sort of focus on. You're going to hear some of the detail of how we do that immediately afterwards, with my colleagues side by side at the front, and from other people as the day goes on. But I just want to ask a simple question up front, which you don't have to answer out loud, largely because I wouldn't understand the answer. But I want you to ask this question in your head, and those of you who were with me yesterday have already been asked this once. Who matters most to you in the world? So just think about that for a second. Who actually matters most to you in the world? Now, you don't have to choose between your children. You don't have to choose between your child and your parent. But just hold in your head and in your heart somebody who really matters to you. Got that? Okay. Now, ask yourself this simple question. How do you want to be towards them? How do you want to act in your dealings with them? Now, if we were in a smaller group and having a conversation, I might hear words like, I want to be caring towards them. I want to be loving towards them. I want to be supportive. I want to be honest. I want to be playful. These would, in this world of psychological flexibility, be things that we call values. Not goals that we achieve, but ways we want to be in the world. So here's one definition by one of the kind of clearest, I think, writers on psychological flexibility, a guy called Russ Harris. And what he says, values are what we want to stand for in life, how we want to behave, what sort of person we want to be, what sort of strengths and qualities that we want to develop. These are the values that we hold, and my values may be subtly different to yours. I'm sure many will overlap. The context we all find ourselves in this room suggests we probably have quite a few things in common. But in detail, what matters most to us in how we want to live our lives may subtly vary between us. And what's basic to these kind of psychological flexibility models that look at values is this principle. That a life well lived is a life that's lived according to your values. In the presence or absence of happiness or of sadness or of physical pain and suffering, a life that's lived according to your values is a life that's well lived with vitality, with flourishing, and with meaning and purpose. Okay. It would be great to claim that had somehow been invented in 1999 by the people who wrote the first Acceptance and Commitment Therapy book. Of course it hasn't. Perhaps not said in quite those words, but that idea has been around in different philosophies, in different faiths and religious traditions for thousands of years. We can definitely go back as far as Confucius and see that written down. And of course, more recently as well. I don't know how many of you in this room have read this book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. A little show of hands, how many people have read it? Okay, smattering. I really recommend it. It is not an easy read. It has particular poignancy and relevance talking about it in this part of the world. Because for those of you who don't know Viktor Frankl, he was an Austrian Jewish psychiatrist who ended up in Auschwitz and then in other concentration camps, who tried to work out, amidst the randomness of life and death there, who psychologically could survive long enough to have a chance of surviving. And one of the things he became very clear about was that the idea of meaning and purpose was at the heart of human resilience and survival. So one of his lines was, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." I do recommend you read that if you have the opportunity. Perhaps not so much the last third, which is him talking about the development of a therapy model, but the personal anecdote of the first 2/3. Okay. You've heard me talk about these as very common factors amongst people who are physically ill, but also sort of common humanity. Now that's a different approach to some psychological and some medical approaches to human suffering. And a very plausible question is, why would we imagine that we have in this an approach that's so broadly applicable? We'll see in a little bit how broadly applicable we think it is. One of my arguments in this will be that it's because this is driven from some of the most sort of basic, fundamental ideas of what makes humans tick. And that includes things like learning processes, what humans will work for, and what motivates people to move one way or another in life, what they will work for. Okay, let me give you an example of this, about working. In behaviour therapy terms, behaviour therapy is at the root of the psychological flexibility models. These values I've been talking about can be considered to be internal reinforcers. Okay, so things that give reinforcement or reward, that come from within rather than from outside. So look, if you do something, you do some work and I give you a reward of money, food, attention, affection, you're more likely to do it again. Right? Even if it's boring, oops, there we go. Even if it's boring, even if it's demanding, even if it's frustrating, we will work for things that we want. And we're not that different to animals in that way. It's very easy to train lots of different animals to work for reward. Now people say it's very easy with dogs. It is. Very easy with pigeons, with rats. Sometimes people say you can't train cats to work for reward. I don't know how many people have seen this little, it's a silent clip, don't worry when you can't hear anything. To maybe suggest a slightly different reality. Let's watch this.
Who is trained?
Very good. And it's very tempting to say what we see there are two cats who've been trained. What are we actually seeing? A human experimenter who's been trained to provide food every time the cat rings the bell. Training's always both ways, isn't it? So there are examples of working for reward. I doubt there's anything basically very entertaining for a cat about just the action of doing that. Who knows? But it's getting rewards, so it continues to do it. But if you're doing something else, if you're doing something that kind of really matters to you, then something different can begin to happen. Sometimes it's not about an external reward. It might be something we do as a hobby. It might be something that we feel passionate about. And in the doing of it, actually we are rewarded by the experience of maybe being creative, or expressive, or helpful, or loving. There doesn't need to be a food pellet to increase that behaviour. The internal experience of doing that which we value becomes rewarding in the technical sense, and the reinforcement being something that increases the likelihood of the behaviour being repeated. And that isn't just about it being fun. If it's cooking something new, that might feel like fun. But sometimes we do things that are in accordance with our values. They're not about fun, but they're still really important, and we may be glad we did them, and we would willingly do them again. So, to look after somebody that we love, who is very ill, who's dying, is not fun. It's not about happiness. Not in that Western euphoric sense. What it can be is deeply rewarding. It can be the most important thing you'll do in your life. And the thing you can look back on and say, I did that right. And if you're unfortunate enough to find yourself in that situation again, you would do it again, in the blink of an eye. Even though I wasn't happy, it actually was sad and tiring and frustrating and terrifying. We would persevere in the face of those things to do something that we find meaningful and worthwhile. Which kind of begs a question. So why don't we simply do all this value stuff all the time? Why aren't we just naturally, through natural processes of reward and reinforcement, already completely occupied with doing valued stuff? Well, because you know what? Stuff gets in the way. No matter how valuable the path we want to walk down is, often there's stuff in the way. And by stuff I mean, I don't know, money, housing, environment, other people. So external things can get in the way of us doing what we want to do. That's true. Physical illness. Yeah, that can certainly get in the way. The symptoms, the changes that ageing brings. But also, and this is one of the things that unites us in this room, also internal stuff, mind stuff, behaviour stuff. Sometimes it's not that stuff gets in the way, sometimes we get in the way. In fact, often, daily, we get in the way. So why would that be? Why would we get in the way of this fulfilling and joyful life that we sometimes have contact with, and yet most of the time we keep missing them? We're all descended, here's one answer. We're all descended from creatures whose instinct, when encountering a threat to our well-being, is to do certain basic things. To fight it, to run away, to stay really still in the hope that it doesn't see you. Or even better, if you get the chance, avoid it, give it a very wide berth in order to not have to encounter it. And if we're dealing with wolves and forest fires and large pits of crocodiles, you know, I don't know if that's a big problem in Katowice, but you know. Us humans, of course, we've added whole loads of new threats. So the threat of standing here in front of a sea of faces can be anxiety-provoking. It's not literally a threat to my existence, but I still experience it as to some degree, threatening, and therefore, you know, the urge to, this morning, just before we started, the urge to be out that door was present for me, and I quite like doing this kind of stuff. So it could be the threat of public judgment, public failure. It could be threats to our status and security. These too become things that evoke a desire to avoid struggle, fight, So we're just these basic creatures that might desire food, water, shelter, warmth, safety, all those stuff. And we try and avoid scary animals, violent people, fire, all that malarkey, all that stuff. Sorry. Malarkey is a terrible word to use. It's a very obscure 19th century piece of English slang. I apologise. We move away from other nonsense stuff. But for us clever humans, we also are threatened by stuff that comes purely from within. Things like thoughts, memories, losses, traumatic recollections, and our emotions, our disgust, our fear, our sadness, our anger. It's really interesting. I get a split of blank looks and people smiling as they recognise which movie the stuff at the bottom comes from. If you've not seen Inside Out, the Disney movie about the emotional development of a young girl, okay, we don't treat it as an exact textbook, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there about development. Again, so far I've recommended one of the most depressing books ever written and a funny Disney movie. I think I'm on the level of it all. So now we've got this whole list of other things to either desire or avoid. We have our joy, our excitement, lust, calm, stimulation. These are things we begin to crave and work towards and move towards. But also, we begin to avoid our sadness, our fear, our anger, our scary thoughts. And this urge towards avoiding the stuff that's difficult, the internal stuff that's difficult, our emotions and our thoughts. In the psychological flexibility model, we refer to as experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance is seen as one of the core elements of this, and you'll be hearing more about it later. But what comes with it is shaping your behaviour, choosing your actions in order not to feel that. And when you start looking for this, you find it everywhere. So when we study this and try and take admittedly questionnaire-based measures often, what you find is lots and lots of areas of psychological difficulty, of suffering. Guess what? The people who are struggling most are also rating highest on experiential avoidance. Now, that may be correlative, maybe correlation, rather than causation, but something's going on there. And notice something else. This is quite an old slide. If I updated this, I bet we'd find lots of other areas as well. Turns out it's present in lots and lots of forms of human suffering. And there's a problem with that. Because even if we're not having problems at this pitch, difficult thoughts, difficult feelings are part of everyday life. They're not just part of everyday life, they increase when we move towards stuff that matters to us. If you think of something you're really incredibly proud of in your life, maybe you've run a marathon, maybe you've climbed a mountain, maybe you've passed those really difficult exams. During that process, particularly in the early stages, my guess is you were plagued by doubts, by concerns, you felt stressed. If at that point you'd chosen to move away from those feelings, to try and shut them down by doing a natural thing of avoidance, you'd never have climbed that mountain, you'd never have passed that exam. you would never have run that marathon. Somehow you found a way to persevere in the face of it. Because if we get ruled by that experiential avoidance, we don't get to do any of the good stuff. The rockier the road, the more flexible we need to be to move forward. So if we're walking along a path that's got lots of difficulty in it, as some of the important things of life will have, then one of my hobbies is walking in the hills and mountains. And I know that the rockier that road is, the more flexible I have to be in my feet and in my body in order to get to the place I want. And it's not just physical, it's also psychological flexibility that we need to move towards the things that matter to us most in life. I'm not proposing to talk through how in acceptance and commitment therapy we try to further promote that psychological flexibility. Again, this is something I know you're going to hear more about. There might be some of you who recognise this slide. Oh, Joanna. For some of you this is very familiar territory already. And for those of you it's not, I'm sure you'll be learning more about it. You'll be learning more about it later. But that's at the heart of the psychological flexibility model, particularly as done by acceptance and commitment therapy. I don't want to explain the how we do it. I want to say a couple of things about what's happened. One of the things that's happened is this has taken off a lot. It really only got put together in this form about 1999. And there was one trial early on by the people who set this up. It seemed to go well. You know, controlled trials, proper scientists who put this together. And then for the first few years, as everyone was trying to get their heads around it, and get a bit better at it, one or two other trials began to crop up. And then this happened. We get this virtually exponential growth in it. And notice this slide goes up to 2015, when we're on 138. Okay? We're early 2017 now. When I checked the other day, we've just gone over 180. I'm certain it'll be more than 200 by the end of the year. So something's kind of taking off. And that's just the randomised controlled trials. Now look, I know we've got really hot scientists in this room. I mean really clever scientists in this room. I know, randomised controlled trials are not the be all and end all. But they're an indication that there might be something worthwhile here. And in addition to this, there are literally thousands of studies of the different components. And some of the technical, underlying things. And some of it's being done by people in this room. And you're going to be lucky enough to hear about some of the components of all of this. But it's not just that it's, yeah, look at the big number of trials. One of the most remarkable things, I think, about this psychological flexibility work is the width of areas that it's looked at. Okay? And many of them, not even traditional mental health areas. So as well as our depressions and our anxieties, anger, there are things that are physical health problems, like chronic pain, cancer, my area. There's sort of addiction type problems, drugs and alcohol. And there's some stuff that's doesn't feel like mental health at all. It isn't mental health at all. So there's stuff that's okay about sort of workplace stress. There's also things that are about learning new skills, about discrimination and prejudice, and even about workplace safety. So one of the things that's kind of nice about this is the range, not just the number of trials, it's the width, the range of those trials that are taking place. Okay. So, we'll do this. Yes, we'll do this. one of the reasons, as I said before, why we think it is applicable across the range is because it's pinned on underlying learning methods. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about this because this will set you up for understanding some of the really applied stuff later in the day. Okay. So ACT needs to be considered as a behavioural therapy based on some of those underlying basic models of learning. Okay. In particular, it's a model of learning and behaviour called functional contextualism. Again, I apologise for the phrase. If you choose to go further with this, you'll learn way more about it. What it basically says is, we cannot understand or do anything useful with any behaviour unless we understand the context in which it takes place and its function or its consequences, its maintaining consequences. Not simply in the short term, but particularly in the long term. So we're thinking about the situation, behaviour and consequences. So for those of you with a background in behaviour therapy, you'll recognise A, B, C. What's the situation? Or we sometimes say antecedents. B, what's the behaviour? C, what's the consequence? And under those circumstances, we're kind of back to those cats again, because we're thinking that the same processes underlie. I'm just going to skip this because we will get horribly lost if we go into it. So we're remembering our ABCs here. And there is no better way of explaining that than cats, and particularly internet cats. How many people here have cats? Is this just an English thing? Everybody has cats, or cats popular in Poland? Yeah, okay, loads of cats. So you know cat behaviour. Okay. So, if a cat hears the sound of a can of food being opened, what happens? Runs to the food bowl. Yeah? So, the situation, the context was sound of a can open. Behaviour, run to the food bowl. Consequence, gets food. It works. It's a dream. Means more likely to do it again in the future. Those are external cues, external situation things. But they can be internal as well. So it could be the time of day. It could be a sensation of hunger. Then the behaviour is different. The behaviour is meowing. I assume the Polish for meowing is meowing. We rub up, the animal rubs up against its human, makes a fuss, pretends it loves you. I'm too cynical about that. Same consequence, it gets its food. Result, more likely to do it in the future. Okay, that's cool. That's what we would call appetitive learning. That's learning driven by reward and something you want. The same's true of things you don't want. Okay, so what happens when a cat sees one of those travel crates? Sees it and next behaviour probably runs and hides. So situation, sees the travel crate. Behaviour, runs and hides. Consequence, well, if it successfully avoids its trip to the vets, then in the short term, it's avoided an unpleasant experience. It will be reinforced for that. But when we think of consequences, we must always think of long-term as well as short-term consequences. So in the long term, sadly, the cat's health declines. So that is then a kind of, what's happened is an avoidant learning has happened. Okay? It's seen it, it's run, it's hidden, and it got reinforced by avoiding the trip to the vet. The fact that there's a long-term really bad consequence for the cat doesn't kind of really play in cat learning territory so much. But those of you who do have cats know there's a gap in this. And the gap is, what is the natural behaviour of a cat presented with a box in its living area? What do cats do next? They love it. They climb in, they take possession of that box. So there has to have been prior learning, a prior classical conditioning event, for you to get that reaction to the travel crate. So on the first attempt, gets in the box, it likes the box, this is interesting. Then it gets closed in and moved out to the car, it's getting a bit less key. And then off it goes to the bed. And that's not so nice for the cat. Okay? That says, that thermometer should not have gone in there. Cat didn't like it. Next time it sees that, that's its reaction. It wasn't its natural, unconditioned reaction, but now we've got that. Okay. That's animal learning. That's a core way of learning. And you know what? It applies to us too, in lots of situations. But there's other really important situations that doesn't read across quite as well. What do I mean by that? If I get a letter through the post that says, "Dear Mr. Owen, I've been for a checkup at my doctor's. They found something in my blood test. I need to see my doctor as soon as possible." Okay, say I get that letter. My reaction is probably fear and alarm. Okay. But I have two questions for you. First, I've never had a letter like that before. So I've never had any negative consequences of that letter. So why am I reacting with anxiety? I've never been punished for receiving that letter. And here's my second one. Even though I'm really scared of that appointment, and I would be, I would still attend. I know I would. I'd be banging on the door of the GPs, insisting on being seen straight away if they found something serious. So even though I'm scared, I go and do the scary thing. Well, how does that work? Because that's not quite like the cat. Well, the boringly obvious answer is there's something different in human learning. Okay? And what's different? Language and thinking are different. Certainly different in extent. We think maybe different in fundamental nature from most of our animals. What that means is, for me, there's a whole set of relationships between things that are relevant here. And if we think of the possible outcome, I'm terrified that that letter means actually I turn out to have cancer, leukemia or something. And suddenly I have a whole network of things that are related to each other. Okay, so this is just a random smattering of English words that might, for me, all be linked together as belonging together, or one of them causing another, or one of them being part of another. But you know what? Any one of them can end up evoking other ones, and therefore potentially maybe driving my behaviour. Because what I could do, so even simple as my appointment letter, getting that letter, even without having experienced these other things personally, I begin to react to that letter to some extent as if I was reacting to those other things. The theory that's underneath all of that from this psychological flexibility approach is something called relational frame theory. You're going to hear more about and more about its applications this afternoon. But it's both a scientific account of how human language develops, helps us learn, understand, and problem solve in a really flexible way. But it is also the way that by its very action will lead us to worry, react as if we're in danger when we're not actually in danger, jump to conclusions about ourselves that just don't help, and get us stuck in rules that don't work. And if we step back and think about it, we know they don't work, and yet we still do it. So within this model, you go down the layers, there's something fundamental about how the human mind works and makes sense of this world and puts it together that makes suffering inevitable. Not a sign that something unusual has gone wrong. It's the other side of the coin that allows us to do all the amazing stuff as well. And in my little example, it could motivate me to moving away from important things. So, here comes my letter. It could be that I would, because I'm feeling scared, avoid my appointments, pretend I'm too busy, tell myself it's a mistake, throw the letter away. Now, it's really important to understand this. Those behaviours all look really different. One of them looks like this, one of them looks like this. The shape of the behaviour is really different. But what we would say is they all have the same function, they're all part of the same functional class of behaviours, because they all are around avoiding that feeling of anxiety, trying to get away from it, trying to get it down. And that would work maybe in the short term. But in the long term, die of leukemia by not getting my treatment quickly. So we are pushed around by a short-term outcome at immense long-term cost. There's another chance. In the face of that, I actually make my appointment. I turn up, I take my chemotherapy, maybe I have a chance of living. In the short term, my anxiety increases. I have the stress of it, a grueling treatment. I'm alongside these people when they have this. It's a hard path to walk in the short term. In the long term, maybe I'm going to be around to see my family develop, to do amazing things, come back to Poland, find out how Game of Thrones ends, all the really important stuff. But it's only by something about how my mind works, how my language works, that puts me in touch now with a payoff later and makes me feel the importance of what I'm doing now, that can reward me and keep me going. And genuinely, day in, week out, in my clinic, when I'm seeing people who are struggling with their chemotherapy, that's the work I'm doing. And if they want to continue with it, I'm helping them get in touch with the why of it in order to be able to tolerate the what of what they're going through. Speak through. So, where does all of that leave us? What that leaves us with is a view of human nature that has, rather than constant ongoing happiness being the ideal, being the goal, that says something else is the goal. The things we value, the things that matter to us in our life. And that what we are doing is to try and walk towards those things that give our life meaning and vitality. Okay? And there we have a beautiful picture. There's the mountain, there's the goal, and there's my path. Except if you walk in mountains like I do, or walk in the countryside, you never get a path like that. I'm not even sure that's real. I think that's probably covered by a fantasy novel. The paths I walk on when I want to get somewhere are way more like that. They're swampy, they're scary, they're hard to follow, and they leave you tired and wet and cold. That path is difficult. But here's the thing, we mustn't tell ourselves the fact that the path is difficult means that something is going wrong. Very often the fact that our path is difficult, by difficult I mean scary, and sad, horrifying, full of horrible mental images, that's very often a sign that we're doing the right thing and that we're moving towards stuff. Because you know what? The destination, even in the middle of this great difficulty, can be worth it. So what have Donna? Can't make her happy. Not continuously enduringly happy. Can't take away her sadness or her fear. Can't take away her unwelcome thoughts, or indeed all of her physical suffering. My colleagues were trying to ease her physical suffering. Can't take it away. But what we can do is reconnect her to what really matters. To being with Amy for as long as she can be with Amy. For being the mother she wants to be for as long as she can be. In the presence of her heart feeling like it's breaking when she's with her. And still do it. And still be there. And still be part of Amy's memories in the future. And in order to do that, she's going to need some help. Don't just say it to her. She needs to learn how can she hold that pain, how can she make room for that pain and still move forward. And then, even if time's short, her life has more value for her, has more meaning and more fulfillment. And that's why I, as a psychologist who works in this area, when I kind of found what people were doing in ACT, that's why the light bulb came on for me. That helps me do my job. But I think it helps loads of people do their job with people with other forms of suffering. If you want to learn more, simply listen to what my colleagues are going to say as the day goes on. There's a brilliant website there that has loads of good stuff. There is now a Polish translation of the core text, if you want to pursue that further, and the very active and very productive Polish ACT group, many of whom are in the room today, have an excellent website and an excellent place on Facebook. I want to thank you. I wish you good luck and enjoy the rest of the conference, and please live well. Take care.